What's going on, everybody? Brandon Rust here. Today we are doing a live. We're going to talk about the science of dry cure, and we have a guest, Shark Mouse Farms, our neighbor up north in Canada. So I just wanted to introduce you, and I guess we'll just kind of hop into it. I'm going to start off by smoking some of this fresh weed. I actually,
Cheers, my friend.
what's that?
What are you working on in there? Is that the lime reserve?
This is the Chem Dog. And
Look,
so I harvested this not last Thursday, but the Thursday before that. So it's Monday now. I harvested Thursday. I toted it up Thursday. It's Monday now. Um, it's got maybe another day or two in the totes, but I picked this piece out. It was good enough to go. And I'm just going to go ahead and it's got that nice crack on there.
and that was going to be one of the metrics that always gets brought up. I think is, well, does the stem snap? And I think we wildly misconstrue where we're trying to land based on that one method of just eyeballing it and does the stem snap, and if it does, then I think we're good to go on an AW. But if you think about like firewood, for example, when we go to burn firewood, we want it to be dry, and you crack it with an axe and it just snaps open because that moisture content in that wood is down below 2% now. And while moisture content itself as a metric is not necessarily a good read, it's a great baseline to sort of understand where you're at. And we want to be somewhere far above the stem snapping point of 2% upwards in the 10 to 12% moisture content when we come off that rack to go into cure. So what we just saw on your plant right there is most likely if you crack the middle of that branch, it's just going to crack and bend but not snap in half, whereas the crow's feet, because they're smaller, should snap clean off. And that's kind of what we're looking for without having any sort of instrumentational measurement to go off of. That would be my eye test, so to speak, are the crow's feet snapping while the stems are still cracking but bending?
Well, what I'm talking about is when I've dried for about 7 to 8 days, I'm talking about just the stem. I'm not talking about the stalk of the plant, but just where that bud is actually connected. And that's a good indicator. When that snaps off, I towed it up. It's not finished drying because that bud still holds so much moisture in the center. And there's the dry cure is really a two-part process, which is bringing the the moisture content down, and then using like the totes to essentially bring that moisture that's internal to have it diffuse across the rest of the material. Because oftentimes what I'll see is people will go, oh, it's my stem snap. They'll trim it up and put it in a jar, in a sealed jar. And so there's no way for that excess moisture to escape that bud. And so the final product ends up being too wet. And then they're like, oh, I got to burp it. So this is the burping process. But the thing is, if you're burping your jars, you're messed up because you put them in a sealed container before
we reached an acceptable safe AW. And I think such a great point you just brought up is that we tend to conflate dry and cure as two separate processes, when we should be looking at the dry and cure process as sort of a linear stepped in process that's just a sequence of the last step, right? It's not like we're finished drying and now cure is this entirely separate thing.
No.
We're trying to accomplish a very specific goal, like you said, and that's to bring the water content of the flower as a whole down to a safe level where microbial activity can't propagate, and where there's still enough moisture to retain the moisture of those volatile oils that creates a smooth smoke. So that's the goal right there. And the way we accomplish that, obviously, is not a linear process, right? It's not like taking a flat piece of paper, leaving it out in the sun, and then we're dry. Like you said, there's multiple facets to a flower that's got to go through layers. And if we think about the drying process exactly as we would osmosis, then we start to understand how water moves throughout the flower, right? So just like osmosis, everything moves from high to low. So if the outside of our flower is dry, then the internal moisture of that flower is going to diffuse to the less moist parts, right?
Yep.
There's a problem with that process because, again, it's not linear. And when we dry it 60-60, we're treating that as a linear process, like it's all going in one flat line, when in fact what's happening is we're using two forces to dry the flower at this point, and one is evaporative forces of our atmospheric pressure in the surrounding environment, which is
and the other is
evaporating.
the internal force of that plant, of the osmotic pressure, and how
Exactly.
hard it's going to take for that water to diffuse from the center of the flower to the outer drier parts.
And
because oftentimes what you'll see is the outside seems really, really crispy. Like, oh, it's over dry, overdid it. They put it in a jar. Oh, now it's too wet. What happened? I thought it was dry. It was because the internal moisture hasn't diffused. And so that second step in that process is essentially to help diffuse that moisture into the rest of the product.
So what ends up happening in that case, right, is that the evaporative forces, the atmospheric pressure of the surrounding environment is a stronger acting force on the water than the adhesion of the capillary chain of that diffusion, right? So more water is going to be pulled out through evaporative forces than that diffusion rate is able to keep up with. At some point, that water chain from the middle of the flower to the outside is going to cut in half, and now the water in the middle is only has one acting force on it. So we're not using as much evaporative pressure to pull that water out. Now it's working on almost diffusion alone to sort of work its way back into that atmospheric realm. Yeah. Sorry about that mic tap there.
And so the first part where you're, using the evaporative forces of the environment to draw moisture, you want to do that as quickly as possible without doing it too fast. Because if you dry too fast and you're not letting the chlorophyll break down, that's where you get those grass type smells.
Right.
So, and then here's the thinking too. There's the part of pre-harvest, right, where you're actually decreasing the moisture content of that flower by allowing drybacks. Now, this is in whether you're in soil, whether you're in cocoa, whether you're in rock wool, it doesn't matter. Letting the dryback happen will reduce internal moisture of that plant, which will help expedite those evaporative forces when you harvest that plant. But when I'm harvesting towards the end, like my environmental parameters, my VPD changes throughout the growth cycle. And so my VPD is much higher at the end of flowering. And so my RH, I'm usually finishing around maybe 50% RH.
Yeah.
No, it doesn't make sense to cut something down and put it in an environment with higher humidity than what I just took it out of. That's counterintuitive to the actual process.
In effect, slowing it down as opposed to continuing on the path we were just on naturally from a physiological standpoint. Absolutely correct.
Exactly. And so that's what I'm trying to tell people. The 70 to 74 degree temperature, 75 degree temperatures, I'm usually finishing mine around like between 75 and 78 degrees, right? So I go from, high or mid 80s, 85, 86, I decrease and I'm ramping down. So I'm already putting it in an environment that's cooler than what it just came out of. Also, so when I'm looking at it from a drying perspective, it's the conditions that it's being placed in are actually better than what I just took out of it.
So, and what's interesting about that is if we look at drying like a line, and we're going to look at it on a graph, right? Within 24 hours, that moisture content plummets down from 90% down to 30%, like a really low range of internal water moisture, or a lot of water comes out in that first 24 hours. So we're going from here to here, but we just talked about breaking that sort of capillary chain, right? And all of a sudden that rate of drying slows significantly. So now we're sort of stagnant, just walking along, trying to get down to that last 10%, as opposed to where when that capillary chain breaks, we increase the vapor pressure and speed up that process a little. Instead of seeing that dive and flatten, we can just sort of see the progressive linear dry continue in a
logarithmic pattern.
So while we're adjusting our parameters, the dry rate stays continual and stable, right? There's not these sort of fluctuations in dry rate, which is again exactly what we're trying to achieve.
Yeah.
And I know you've gotten pushback on the temperature simply based off a volatility perspective. And I was wondering if you'd like to talk to that aspect of it.
Yeah, so I think the research says that most of those monoterpenes start volatilizing above about 77 degrees. So we're several degrees above the volatility point. Now, I can't speak on every single like monoterpene, but those are the ones that are the most volatile because of you know, the size of the carbon chain. Now, I'm preserving a lot of the cannabinoids and terpenes because I'm drying it faster and I'm getting it into my jars faster. So let's say 10 to maybe 12 days on my end versus most people are still hanging at 2 weeks. Some people are like, "Oh, I'm doing a slow cure." Like that is supposed to be like something that I want. I don't even want to smoke flower that's like that because it gives them that much more time to be susceptible to pests and pathogens, oxidation, volatilization of, um, you know, volatile
Off gassing,
compound.
degradation, the major components of the oxidization of those secondary metabolites are light, heat, oxygen, and simply time.
Yeah.
There's kind of no escaping that. There's several peer-reviewed studies that have been published. One of the most interesting one looked at 37 of the major cannabinoids and terpenes based on their interaction with with drying temperature. And the most interesting find out of the whole scenario was that between a variation of 4 degrees Celsius and 100 or 39 degrees Fahrenheit and 100 degrees Fahrenheit, there were losses in terpene content, total terpene content over time, but not nearly as much as compared to what time at any exposure rate at a temperature above 39 degrees cost. So, for example, if we look at flour that was dried at 60 degrees versus flour that was dried at 75 degrees, we're going to see a 1% loss, a total loss from the 60% to the 75%. But over the course of 2 weeks, we're going to see a total loss of secondaries of up to 33% just based on the time at any of those conditions. So it doesn't matter if it's 60 degrees, 65 degrees, 72 degrees, 75 degrees, or 80 degrees, you're going to see that exponential loss happen over time. And the only way we're going to stop that is by getting it into conditions that are below 39 degrees or getting it onto the shelf and into your consumer's lungs before that degradation happens. So ideally, we don't want to be sitting on flour for a month and a half, letting it slow cure, letting all of those oxidative forces act on the flour as it happens.
And so like this flower that's in this jar was harvested 11 days ago. And when you pop it open, it just hits you in the face. You know what I mean? It's not, there's no loss. Oh my God, it's so loud. There's no loss when you increase your temperatures. In fact, in my opinion, it's better because you're preserving things, because again, oxidation is your biggest enemy as well, because when you start to allow oxygen to degrade the material, it's not just breaking down the plant material, all the cannabinoids, all the flavonoids, all the terpenes, the active ingredients of those things, they change. THC converts into CBN, different terpenes convert into other compounds. And when I'm doing selection work and stuff like that, it's like that's good. Like you can do that if you want to age things, but if you want to experience the maximum effect and potency of that flower, for me, it's getting it into the jar, sooner than later. And
yeah, so
we should talk about that second part of the process, right? Because again, I'll go 7 to 8 days. Typically, the outsides of those flowers are dry enough to where we can tote them up to help distribute the remaining moisture thoroughly throughout the rest of the flower.
So, and when I said initially that we should be treating cure as just a complementary part of drying, and that's exactly what I mean. Is that our flour is now down to a safe AW, but the moisture within that flour isn't evenly distributed. Now, when we get it into our jars and drop it into our cure conditions, which less so about temperature and more so about equilibrium, relative humidity. But this part is just about ensuring that every part of that flour is now evenly distributed with the same amount of moisture, so that it's not grinding up powdery on the outside and like that kinetic quicksand on the inside, which will allow some more of that metabolic degradation to occur within that flour material. We're still trying to degrade chlorophyll pigments and lipids and alcohols and all sorts of chemical interactions are still happening while there's moisture content in that flour. And we want to be able to get it off the rack down to a safe moisture content and have that water evenly distributed throughout the flour so we can use it as quickly as possible. The whole point isn't to, like marbling a steak, keep it on the shelf for 110 days. It's to get it to where we need it to be so we can experience it at its best before that best starts declining.
Yeah. And one of the things that I wanted to touch on too, dry cure is one thing, aging is completely different, because I think that gets confused a lot of time, where people are assuming that they are curing when it's really storage or aging. And aging is the process of letting that material oxidize to have those chemical conversions happen. Some people like more sedative product, and so having a higher CBN level will provide those benefits.
Well, so one of the things that seems a little counterintuitive here that I'm about to say about our drying is, as soon as we chop it down, that secondary metabolite count starts dropping, and we've got to preserve them all as quickly as possible. But here's the thing, right? If we allow some degradation to occur while it's in the jars curing a little bit longer, yes, we're losing some of that overall secondary metabolite count. So we're going to lose some terpenes, we're going to lose some cannabinoids as they oxidize, but we're still allowing that chemical process of degradation of the unwanted stuff to occur as well, which at the end of the day, from our olfactory perspective, makes it feel like a more refined experience, because those terpenes that are remaining are now much more pronounced without the adulteration of those other things we don't want to have. Sometimes heat is a good thing in these processes, right? From a physics perspective, kinetic energy is what metabolism is, and the warmer we have something, the more chances of a chemical interaction occurring, and the more chances of a chemical interaction occurring, the more metabolism happens within a live organism. So there is a trade-off between getting all those things done within an acceptable time frame before we start seeing unacceptable losses, and also accepting some loss in order to have a bit of refinement in our end product, right? So I don't mind losing 1 or 2% curing above 39 degrees Fahrenheit to redistribute that moisture and allow some of that chlorophyll breakdown to happen over the course of a week, 10 days, or whatever it is, before we're ready to either smoke or get that into cold storage for when it is ready to go.
Yeah. And for me, like I said, the secondary part where I'm toting it into totes without an airtight lid, where it still where it's still in that environment, it's really just about redistribution of that moisture. So that way,
So
if I were to just pick a bud right off the plant and smoke it with, the same time, but it not being tote, it doesn't smoke as well. And it's because that moisture hasn't been thoroughly distributed throughout
So
the
this
room.
is done with certain crops, and it's called sweating. And it's actually a very effective methodology for redistributing that moisture, because, like I said, you still have that kinetic heat from the ambient environment, where it's allowed to do some of those metabolic processes that it's still trying to complete with an available moisture content within the flour. And once we redistribute that internal moisture to the outer layers of the flour, now we're like, from a biological standpoint, that whole flour is now sort of evenly breaking down those fats and those pigments into colorless CFCs, and we're not experiencing what's called a lock-in of some of those compounds, because there's no longer a sufficient amount of moisture content to complete those processes, right? So even if we're drying at 60-60 for 2 weeks, if we've got the issue where we've dried the outside part of the flour and we're waiting for the internal part of the flour to dry in, that whole time we're waiting for that moisture to work its way out of the flour, the outside of the flour is so dry that there's no metabolism breaking down the chlorophyll we were trying to break down in the first place, right? So it's all about maintaining it as much even moisture as we dry down as we can until we get to our right conditions. And then, like food, we don't just leave it sitting out on the table all day waiting to eat. Somebody's got to come and eat it while it's hot and fresh.
Yeah, that's how I feel about it too. So that was a excellent breakdown. I hope the people in the chat caught all that. I know some people will continue doing it the way that they like best, which is fine. I guess there's no wrong way to skin a cat. But when we're talking about commercial production or things that are going to be on the consumer market, especially things that are tested for pathogens, when you have a high humidity, cooler environment, just because you're 60% relative humidity is still enough humidity for pathogens to grow, and
So
the longer amount of time that your water activity level is above a certain threshold, the potential for those pathogens to colonize and continue to grow in that material increases.
I did the numbers on this just before I hopped in here because that was one of the more interesting aspects to me is, if we're drying at 60/60, the whole goal is to ensure that we're maintaining a line above dew point so there's no internal moisture to germinate those spores, right? But what we're missing here is your ambient room is 60% humidity. But the internal RH of that flower, because of the moisture content, is sitting upwards in the 85 to 90%, which puts our dew point down at around 57%. So for the first 24 hours, when that moisture content's up in the 90% range, we're sitting 3 degrees above our dew point. Any micro cooling from evaporative cooling effects, or from your HVAC unit, or microclimates of any capacity, and you dip 3 degrees lower than you anticipated in any spot in that room, those spores are going to start germinating and fruiting, and there goes an entire crop. The other aspect of this is if you are a commercial cultivator, you're saving yourself 10 days on every harvest, getting them off the rack and into stores, right? That's, if you look at that over the course of a year, you can pack in potentially an extra grow and harvest with time saved.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. And, that's one of the biggest things when we're talking about products that are being commercially consumed is being able to pass those tests. And every state is a little bit different. And this is one of the ways that, you can really avoid running into those issues.
And just for visual reference, I brought up a little sample here. I chopped these down 4 days ago. You all saw me do it. I pulled it out of a bag here, but you can see, where are we here? You can see that these leaves will just sort of come right off like that. The flower itself, right, just kind of cracks open nice. We've got but it's still very dense and sticky, right? It's exactly kind of what we're looking for and that's 4 days done. I could go and smoke this right now. I think it needs to come down another 2 or 3%. But as far as smell and texture is concerned, there's any of the complaints we generally hear people think that are going to come from this process, I've never seen. Otherwise, I wouldn't continue to do it. Right? I benefit in no way, shape, or form leading people down the wrong path. What I want to emphasize here is that you and I didn't make this up. It's not something we just decided one day, hey, everybody's doing it this way. Let's be merry contraries and go do something else. Everything we've spoken about today, there's very well articulated, reviewed and published data on in the academic scientific field. And this in itself has been shown to not even be the most effective means of drying. There's every day we're coming up with new technologies, preservation and nitrogen drying, and a whole sort of new era of technology that are going to find better and better ways to do this than our conventional means. But as far as conventional drying is concerned, the science has led me to this point that shows that this is more effective than what we had been doing, for decades previous.
Yeah. And like I said, what's jarred up, I just put it in a jar this morning. It's 11 days old. It was dried. It was toted. It's
Just
still
nice
got
snap.
it's got that nice snap still, you know. So the bud snaps. It's like a stale marshmallow.
Not disintegrating. It's not
No, but it
exactly
doesn't
what we're looking for.
disintegrate. It's and dude, I'm telling you, the way that this smells, when Hamilton was in here earlier, he popped the top off, and before he even got his nose in it, he pulled back. He was like, "Oh shit."
Yeah.
So, I mean, I've been doing this a long time, so I've, I came to the conclusion, um, I don't know how long ago, but I've been doing the same method for a long time because, one, I'm a little impatient. And so I think that's one of the reasons why I was like, I want this to speed up. How can I?
Hurry up. 14 days looking at the same plant hanging in the garage.
Yeah. And so it's like, well, I think that the real trick is decreasing the moisture content as far as the environment will allow, and then getting it toted up and doing the sweating, like you said, which is, and not in a sealed container either. I always use the HDX totes with the yellow lids, and those do not have a like a
No,
seal on them. So
yeah,
it can
no
still
silicone cast.
allow the dissipation of moisture from those totes.
Oh, so question I get asked all the time, as I'm sure you do, is if I don't have expensive lab equipment to test water activity, which if you want one, it's going to be 7 to 10 grand. Like, they're not cheap at all. Wood moisture meters are a good barometer, but they're not necessarily accurate. You got to take multiple samples multiple times, and you'll get it's like trying to use a bad pH pen. Like, it'll get you in range, but never going to be right. Um, the most effective, easy analog method you can use is filling up a 500-liter mason jar about 80% of the way, 75% of the way full, sealing that up with a hydrometer inside, leaving it for an hour, and seeing where it stops climbing at your RH. So if you take your RH divided by 100, that's that equals your AW. So if your RH stops climbing at 64%, and it says inside your jar is 64% humidity, divide that by 100, your AW is going to be 0.64 AW.
Which is a good, I think it's 6.6 to 0.65.
Yeah, I like to sit anywhere between 0.58 to 6.4 is my happy range, but the safe range generally is up to 6.6. I would not go higher than that. Some say you can go up to 6.8, but that's pretty squishy to me.
Yeah.
And I believe yeast is still somewhat capable of germinating in 0.68, depending on what strain we're talking about. But that 0.6 range is just perfect as far as I'm concerned. It leaves a little bit of moisture to give that stickiness, but also depends on how you like the consistency of your flour. But to be in the safe range, generally in the 0.58 to 0.64 range, and you'll be happy with your end product.
Yep. It's far for me. I've never used hydrometers. I can tell. I can feel the bud.
Oh,
You know
absolutely.
what I mean?
Absolutely.
I've been doing it long enough that I know when it's safe to tote up.
Yeah, you like as soon as I touch the flour in this bag, I could say, like, yeah, it needs to go down to like about 10% or so. Like, you'll start to definitely get a feel for it, especially once you have reference examples in mind, run after run after run after run, as I'm sure a lot of our viewers here do. But again, if you find that jar is continuously climbing, that's the point of burping. So we don't want to just sit there every hour and, oh, we got off gas, right?
Yeah.
We just want to do that till we're in, like, so if we put it in, we don't want to see it climbing above our safe range. That means we're in way too early. We're just burping to adjust that range we want to put it at. So if we put it in at 0.63 and we want to get it down to 0.58, we'll burp it until we get to that point. But we're not trying to manage the dry inside the jar.
I don't do any type of burping or anything like that because nothing of mine will ever go into a jar until it's gone through that full process
Yep.
where the moisture has already been distributed. So it is stabilized when I put it in a jar. If
Yeah,
you
so
notice,
that HDX tote process of yours is sort of the stand-in for that process before they get into jars for smoking, which is uh, might even be more efficient based on the way you're sweating them out. To be honest, I have not tried it personally, but like I said, if we're trying to gauge and you want to see where we're at, it's a pretty
yeah,
good to,
that's a
to,
good tip. That's a good tip with the hydrometer and putting it in a jar. If you're not experienced enough to go by feel and breaking up one of the buds on the plant to see if it's ready to go into a tote, using that method to make sure that your water activity level is low enough would
super cheap
definitely,
and super easy to implement for sure.
yeah, absolutely. I mean, a ball jar, those hydrometers are like $2 or $3, those little
Yeah,
square ones. I know exactly what you're talking about.
yeah, a little orange circle on the outside of it or whatever. Yeah, you can get them at even the dollar store for like a pack of 6 of them or whatever. They're accurate, they're cheap, it's easy. It takes you an hour to like sort of know where you land, and then you can feel safe putting them, on your shelf or whatever, not having to worry about whether it's too high or too low. So um, that Afghani bull rider, man, looks stunning.
The Afghani bull rider is a San Diego created variety. It was created by my mentor. It was, it's kind of like a legend down there. And yeah, dude, we did some crosses. We did the Afghani bull rider cross to Hazy Kush. And then we also did Afghani bull rider cross to 89 Northern Lights. That was a collaboration between me and
The
Green
NL
Birdie.
the NL has always been a favorite of mine for sure.
Yeah. So what I like to do on my show, on my lives, is open it up to Q&A for anybody who might have some questions. So I think that if you're open to taking some questions, um,
Absolutely.
we can have the chat. There's 89 people in here right now. If you guys have any questions about what we're talking about, the dry cure, aging, anything like that, just drop a comment and we'll answer those. I'm gonna see if I can scroll back through a couple of these comments and see if there was any questions here.
That's what I'm doing right now. Sorry to leave you guys on hook here. So one of the analogies I like to give people when I'm talking about using a step up drying protocol is, imagine you've got two identical sponges, right? And you dip one of those sponges in water and it's soaking wet, and the other one's perfectly dry. And if you put those two together, what's going to eventually happen is this one's only going to be 50% wet, and this one's going to be 50% wet, right? And that'll be with no other forces acting on it other than the diffusion of capillary action. So we're going to see the dry one pull all the water from,
Yep.
or half of the water from the wet sponge, until they're both exactly the same and they reach equilibrium exactly like osmosis. Now, what we'll see happen is the evaporative forces from the outside are going to dry that first sponge again, um, much faster than the water from the wet sponge is going to be able to replenish the water there. So it's always about managing your dry rate so that water is fluidly moving through both sponges to the outside at the same time without having one get dry while one stays wet.
Yeah, that's a really good visual representation of how diffusion works. It's really easy for people to understand. And diffusion is one of the ways nutrients are taken up.
And when I talk about accepting a certain amount of loss in cure for a more refined experience, another good analogy that I was thinking about is, you you go mining for a big massive hunk of diamond, and you've got this big chunk of beautiful rock, but then you take it to a jeweler who lops off edges and shapes it into this stunning sparkling piece of jewelry, right? And while the carat weight is much different, the value of the refined rock is much better because it's a better experience for everyone.
Yep. So I have a question from Banacana. Do plant size and stem size matter or affect things for hanging for your process? I have
Okay,
very large outdoor plants, and I'm going to
so
say yes.
the
Go
the
ahead.
cool the cool thing about this is to one of those forces that we talked about. We talked about two forces being applied on drying. One of the evaporative forces, the other diffusion. Diffusion works on a principle called first law, um, which explains how water will move from a low gradient from a high gradient to a low. Fick's second law describes how that will go faster with more force being applied on it. So the more water we have, or the more water we have to diffuse to more dry space, the more water will diffuse quicker. So essentially, it scales at the same rate because of the mass of the water, for lack of a better word, right? The more water is causing more diffusion, whereas less water causes less diffusion. So the larger flower will in fact diffuse at a relatively consistent rate as the small one, with the exception that it has more water to pull out. So if we think about it, if I have a really big garden hose, but I poke 100 holes in it, it's going to lose X amount of water. And if I have a smaller garden hose and I poke one hole into it, it'll lose the same amount of water compared to the hose size as the larger hose with the larger holes, right? So basically, the larger we scale up, the larger the force being applied to it, meaning that those size differences are negligible compared to the scale of the force being applied on it, if that makes sense.
So I think that the biggest challenge that is going to be that if you don't have the dehumidification for those larger plants is the real issue, right? So
Absolutely,
it could take
absolutely.
longer because again, you have more water in a smaller area, and if you're not able to remove that or exert that force, then it could potentially take a little bit longer to dry.
So, and that's exactly why I said yes to the one of the forces, but no to the other force,
Yeah.
because at some point in the evaporative side of things, we're going to reach a saturation point where we hit equilibrium because of the fact that there's more water in that space than there would have been with smaller flowers, right? So more CFU in that circumstance would be necessary in order to mitigate saturation, which, if we're being honest, in a dry room, I'd like to see as minimal air exchange as possible so that we can keep getting to those saturation points evenly without overshooting them, right? So again, there's a bit of a trade-off there. Yes and no. I think if, like you said, you can manage those dehumidification needs, then the evaporative rate remains relatively constant. But in a sealed space, like if you try to do large flowers in a 4x4 drying room versus one small plant, you're going to reach a point where that room hits saturation, and we slow that process down.
Yeah. All right. We have a question from Joe. It says, is 80 degrees too hot to dry in a tent for this process?
Another double-edged answer here, because
It'll
from
work. It will work, and you'll dry pretty quickly at those temperatures, given that you have low enough humidity. However, if you dry too fast, the water activity level will be too low for the chlorophyll to break down,
bingo.
and um, you can start volatilizing organic compounds. Usually, like I said, above 77.
And another factor that comes with volatilization is dehydration of those compounds, right? If we get those compounds too dry before the rest of the flower is dried out, that in itself is enough to volatilize an oil, for example, that loses its water molecule because it's been in too high pressure of an environment while waiting for that diffusion chain to occur. So yes, you're right. It absolutely will work, especially on a smaller scale. I would just be more concerned about not being able to break down those unwanted compounds because it's going a little bit too quickly.
Yeah. That's the way I feel about it. Also, yeah, drying too fast, it'll make your weed taste and smell like hay. Okay, so Studio Osgrow says on the commercial side, what do you guys recommend holding your product in after the dry period is done? So whenever I've done any like commercial production or larger production, um, that usually goes into turkey bags. Turkey bags has been my go-to forever. I've never really used anything else. Aside from that, I always put mine in glass jars, ball jars for life. I'm surprised I don't have a ball tattoo.
Yeah,
Um,
I love the mason jars. They're simple, they're easy, and they work very well.
yep. So that's kind of my go-to. If you're running like where you're putting together packs, my go-to has always been turkey bags. But there's things like Grove bags now. There's cure tubes. There's all kinds of things that you can use. It's
Yeah,
just, I guess, personal
steel's
preference
super
at that
cheap
point.
too. Also, stainless steel tins are dumb cheap.
Yeah, like the sea vaults or whatever. There's all different types of options. It really becomes personal preference.
Yeah, and I mean, at the end of the day, from a commercial perspective, ideally, get it out the door and into the dispos, make it their problem as quickly as possible, right? It's you want that product into your customers' lungs as quickly as you can once you chop it down and get it and get it ready to go. Because the same experience that customer has with your product at week 3 out from chop is going to be vastly different than they have in June, 4 months down the road from now, that same flower in that same pack.
Yeah. So Banacana said room size versus amount to be tried, and we already kind of touched on that. It remains about how fast you can remove the excess moisture from that room. That's the
Yeah,
main.
and ideally we don't want to have a ton of open air just to, you know, constantly. We're trying to reach a specific saturation point. We don't want to hit it too early, obviously, but we also don't want to just allow um, this fresh, dry air to constantly be coming in and always be, because we will overshoot our target because there's no target for it to stop at based on the room's parameters, right? If it's constantly pushing the flower to go past this spot because the RH is never reaching saturation, it's just going to keep pulling water constantly, and you're going to have to be waiting there like, oh, it's ready now, so we don't overshoot it, right?
Yeah.
Yes, lowest air
Follow
exchange.
up question. So I'm looking for the lowest air exchange rate to accomplish the parameters. Correct.
Bingo.
Yep. Let's see what else we got in here. Here we go. Here's another question. What is the best method to size a dry room based on flower room size?
So
That's a really good question. So if you're looking at your dry room size, if you like, here's a good example. If I'm running two 12-foot beds that are 4 foot wide, the canopy space from where that canopy starts flowers and those dimensions are essentially should fit that. If you're doing something vertical where you're stacking it on a rack, you can take that into consideration as well. But like he just said, you don't need a ton of extra room. You just need to be able to control the removal of moisture from that environment.
a super simple way to look at it is just um, canopy surface area, right? The same amount of canopy surface area you needed to grow that flower, which was presumably 100% of your 4x8 tent, right? So your canopy covers all 32 square feet of that canopy footprint. Like into curing and making sure that we're hitting our AW, we want to fill that room to about 75% of its capacity to allow just enough air exchange. So once we chop those plants down, the true gore pressure in the leaves drops. We're still taking up in that space about 75% of the volume of that footprint, which is incidentally ideal for the amount of air exchange we're looking for at the end of the day. As simple as you could be, same size they grew and would be the best size to dry them in, just based on the amount of air volume in the space that they were used to living in. Where
Yeah.
anything I do in cultivation, from one phase to another, I never want it to be so dramatically different from what was happening the day before, right? Like the plants don't operate in these areas of wild swings. Everything's a sort of linear, easy slope and a gradual swing up and down. And that doesn't necessarily change just because we got to the end of its life.
Let's see, just scrolling through these comments. See if we got any more questions in here. All right, I think that about wraps it up for the Q&A section. We're right about 45 minutes. I think this would be a perfect time to stop. I just want to say I appreciate you coming on here.
So I think when you look at our two followings, they're relatively, on opposite sides of the ledger when it comes to methodology or whatever. And I think people think that you and I have somewhat of a contentious relationship because of that. But the way I see it is you and I are both trying to achieve the exact same goal at the end of the day, and we're both driven by the data and are only looking for the most relevant information to apply to our circumstances. And I think it's amazing that you and I could sort of meet here in the middle to achieve those sort of things and help bring our followings closer to an understanding on what we're trying to do as well.
Yeah, and the thing is, just because people do something different or have different ideals doesn't mean you can't be friends with them. It doesn't mean you can't have conversations about the different methodologies, because there's always something to learn. Like having debates, even though we're right on point with, we have the same exact, but when it comes to cultivation styles and stuff like that, I do living soils, you do hydro. And I'm not hating on anybody's style. I like my method because I have my reasons. For you, you do your thing because you have your reasons. And we can have debates about those stuff and so that everybody can learn the pros, the cons, the methods, because everybody's going to do things different. Every system's different. So having conversations like this where we can bring people from both sides together to see not just the differences, but where things are real similar.
Absolutely. The commonality in certain aspects of things as well. And I think, like you, is that, the reason, my methodology is what it is because of the function of what it is I do for a living and what I'm trying to provide my community. Right. And that's here's what the scientific information says. So I implement that information as a visual aid to show you that that's what the science says. But if you look right outside the wall behind me, there's 3 15-foot plants in 20-gallon soil pots, right? Like I don't show it very often because it's not what my followers are generally here for. But I think for whatever my circumstances are, I'm going to do what's most effective for me. And outside in my forest in the sun, that's what works best for me. Not implementing my dry back crop steering. So I think for everybody's circumstances to do and utilize what works best for them, I'm always going to support. I'm always happy to help guide if I've got any useful insights in that area for them. I do what I do because this is kind of my shit, right?
I think another good subject that we might come back and revisit, maybe if you're down to do another one, is crop steering, because I do crop steering in my beds as well. And I know that a lot of people don't do things like drybacks and this and that. And using the data, I know when I can, I know when I shouldn't. And it's a really interesting because there's different methodologies for the same concepts because the systems are different.
So much of it gets lost in jargon, right? But if you step back and sort of look at all of these things that we both do sort of diametrically opposite of one another, they're not that opposite on a big picture scale, right? Like, for example, like you just brought up, and I'd love to be back on to talk about it in depth. So when we talk about crop steering, all we're really doing is utilizing the ebb and flows of a dry and wet cycle, like you would with rain and not rain, right? So I think that's actually a great idea, is to come on and we can sort of look at the similarities and contrast between both methodologies that maybe bring some people to one side or the other as well.
Awesome. Cool. Well, it was great having you on. Great conversation. I appreciate everybody who came and joined the live today. Definitely go check out the website, bokashiearthworks.net. We're having some sales. I'll see you guys later.
Appreciate you having me on. Thanks, man.
Yep.